Hello, everyone. I'm Kristen Hunter from EXL Events, and on behalf of EXL and the Avoca Group, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on ICH E6 R2 risk-based requirements. As many of you know, EXL and Avoca have an established partnership with the goal of providing the industry with valuable information through presentations at conferences as well as webinars like this one. There are just a few technical things I'd like to address before we get things started. To the left of the slides, you should see a Q&A box. If you don't, then click Q&A on the menu bar at the bottom of your screen, and that box should appear. Use this Q&A box to submit questions at any time throughout the webinar. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can during and after the presentation, but we have a lot of people on this webinar, and it's likely we will not be able to address all of them within the allotted time. So if your question goes unanswered, someone from the Avoca Group will contact you following the webinar with the answer. To the right of the slides, you'll see vertical banners for two related upcoming events. Our third European Clinical Quality Oversight Forum, which is taking place February 25th and 26th in London, and our 10th Proactive GCP Compliance Conference on March 18th to 20th in Philadelphia. Both of these conferences feature expert presentations from the Avoca Group. You can click directly on those banners to be taken to the website for more information, and you can take advantage of a special 15% discount off of the standard rate using the code WEBINAR. Above the Q&A box on the left side, you'll see a photo of today's speaker, Steve Whitaker, who is a senior consultant at the Avoca Group. Steve is a well-known industry expert on project management, pharmaceutical development, clinical development, outsourcing strategies, and execution plans. He retired from Eli Lilly, where he served as Chief Operating Officer, Director of Operations and Project Management for the Cardiovascular Acute Care Platform. You can click the arrow underneath of Steve's photo to view his entire bio. Now, before I turn this over to Steve, I want to take a quick moment to ask a couple of polling questions just to give us a sense of who is in the audience today. So the first one is, what type of company do you represent? Pharmaceutical, biotech or device company, CRO, other clinical service provider, site, or other? And I'll just give you a couple moments to go ahead and complete that. All right, let's take a look at those results. So 70% pharmaceutical, biotech, or device companies. So we're very heavy on the trial sponsor side in this audience. About 17.5% CRO, and the rest are other clinical service providers, sites, and others. Great. I have one more question. What size would you consider your company? Small company, mid-sized company, or large? You can go ahead and click the dot next to the word and then click the submit box. That's the best way to submit your answer. All right, let's go ahead and see what those results are. Oh, very nice, a very even split. So we have about 30% small, a little more than that, 37% mid-sized, and then about 30% large. That's an excellent split. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Steve then, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are located. I am going to proceed relatively quickly through a number of slides just to give you some framing, and I want to ensure that we have sufficient time for questions toward the end of the session. But I do want to focus on core content that would be of value for you. Relative to that content, just as a quick framing and background for those of you who may not be familiar with the Avoca Group, a lot of this content comes because of the construct that Avoca has with three main components. We have a quality consortium that I'll describe a little bit more in detail in just a moment. We also have consulting and research services, and both of those are very much in the space of clinical research and development. We also have a diligent qualification platform for providers, and so that's the foundation by which we have expertise within the industry. In particular, the Avoca Quality Consortium has more than 100 member companies made up of sponsors, CROs, clinical service providers, other organizations that represent investigative sites, and other technical service groups as well. The consortium focuses on industry-leading practices, focusing on research as well to establish those leading practices, addressing quality in the space where there are significant gaps. And we've been doing that since its inception in late 2011. And our focus and effort has always been on risk-based approaches, which you will find is especially relevant for what we'll be sharing with you today. This next diagram is basically an eye chart. I won't spend time on it, but it represents the member companies of the consortium. This is available for your review on the Avoca Quality Consortium website. Many of you may see your companies represented here. But today, we want to focus first on reviewing and understanding requirements, especially those that are focused on ICH E6 Revision 2 that are in fact targeted for clinical development, but also on the Q9, which is easily translatable from a GMP construct to a GCP environment. After we do that quick framing and background of the requirements, we're going to look at leading practices, in particular around risk planning, but most importantly on the evaluation and control and documentation, because many companies have started risk planning approaches, but making those successfully deliver value back to the organization through ongoing evaluation, control, and documentation tends to be one of the more significant challenges. So we will focus on that today. We'll be looking at how lessons learned is part of those leading practices, what you can do about mitigations that are leading practices, and how that plays into process improvement, not only at a study level, but across an organization or organizations. We will also look at the use of metrics, in particular around ICH E6 Revision 2 focuses on thresholds and quality tolerance limits, and the considerations of adjustments to those, because adjustments to QTLs has been a significant question that we have heard within the industry. So as I begin looking at the review of those materials, this first slide focuses on ICH Q9. This is an image that was first presented by that group in 2005. It clearly, while it's focused on a GMP activity, you can see how it's easily translatable to a GCP environment. So it basically says in order to initiate quality risk-based approaches, you have to understand the construct of risk assessments, which includes identification, analysis, and evaluation. Risk control, that is partly defined by risk reduction, but also in appropriate circumstances, acceptance of risks. And then how that leads to active results that can be interpretable, that feed into communications and into risk management tools and plans and activities. And then ultimately how an ongoing review allows the living, those initially created documents to become living documents in an integrated fluid process for communications, actions taken, and improvements made. So this was an image first projected by the Q9. More recently, in November of 2016, and being adopted by a large percentage of the regulatory agencies around the globe today, is ICH E6 Revision 2, which is very targeted for clinical. So from a quality management construct in section 5.0, you'll see each of the sections of 5.0.1 all the way through 5.0.7 that in its own way articulates the requirement to identify critical processes and data, and then identifying relative to those the risks and evaluating those, controlling them, communicating about those, reviewing them, and reporting to those. As we look at that, I want to first focus on some definitional aspects of risk management so that we are all thinking in a similar fashion for what those requirements are. So risk management is a combination of activities that include each of the components of assessment, control, review, communication, as well as other things related to documentation and control. If we look at risk identification, we want to make sure that we begin to think of it as a systematic use of information. So many companies use risk plans as very one-off. They're study by study. They are kind of independent study teams who don't focus on historical insights, perspectives that other teams have had, risks that have become issues for other programs that should be learned from and incorporated in risk plans for new studies or new programs. So risk identification should not be just one-off, each study team starting from blank sheets of paper, but a systematic use of information. We'll talk more about that. The assessment then also becomes a systematic process. So again, you can do some things that are not study-specific or study team-specific, but organizational-specific and or even across organizations between sponsors, providers, investigative sites, where you look holistically at where the greatest risks have created the greatest issues and the impact for patients or data interpretability or other factors that are important. And that systematic review and assessment of that information can then be brought into new study teams for an enhancement of the analyses and the rest of the activities. So therefore, risk analyses include the defining and the estimation of those risks and the probability that they're going to happen, the impact when they do occur, and the detectability of those risks as well, which is most effectively assessed by historical insights and information from either your own study teams within your organization or from your providers, if you're working with providers, or through industry consortia such as the Avoca Quality Consortium. When we get to risk evaluation, the intent is to define the comparison of the risk given to the criteria and the risks for whether it's patient safety, data interpretability, or other important factors that could be cost-based, timeline-based, etc. And what's the risk attitude of an organization? What's the appetite that an organization is willing to either accept a risk or reduce or minimize the risk? And therefore, that leads to a tolerance level that gets predefined. And that should all be a part of a very conscious and intentional evaluation. Therefore, then that leads to either risk reduction, which is actions taken to lessen those. Those can either be through mitigations, which are done proactively to prevent risks from ever happening, or can be through contingencies that can be executed should triggers or metrics or thresholds or tolerance limits be approached, whereby you want to take a contingency action to minimize the implication of the risk and or the likelihood that it actually is fully received or identified. But in some cases, risk acceptance is appropriate, and those have to be within the risk tolerance of an individual company, but also recognition of where regulatory agencies and others will accept where you have defined that acceptance level. And so those decisions can be pre-identified and documented. The reason it's important to clarify those definitions is now if we look specifically at the language within ICH E6 Revision 2, Section 5.0.4 talks about risk control. This is the language pulled from that. In particular, I'm going to highlight what that language states. First, the sponsor should decide which risks to reduce and or which risks to accept. So the regulatory agency actually is acknowledging the possibility to accept risk or a focused effort to reduce the risk. In addition, the approach used to reduce the risk to an acceptable level should be proportionate with the significance of the risk. And what is that significance of the risk? Who defines that? Who clarifies what is a significant risk? Well, in part, it goes on to say that predefined quality tolerance limits should be established, and we're going to talk more about quality tolerance limits because that's created some anxiety within the industry about what those tolerance limits are, how they're to be used. But it should take into consideration the medical statistical characteristics of the variables that will be predefined. I'm going to talk more about that in this presentation, and the design of the trial. and to identify systematic issues that can impact, and this is the agency's focus, on subject safety and the reliability of trial results. Sponsor companies, CROs, and others may also be interested in risks related to the project execution, like timelines, cost, and other factors of quality. But the agencies are focused predominantly on safety and reliability of the trial results. Finally, the language says that the detection of deviation from the predefined quality tolerance limits should trigger an evaluation to determine if action is needed. So the only way we can detect deviations is by actively monitoring appropriately mapped metrics. And ideally, you would want predictive leading indicator metrics, not lagging metrics. And we'll talk a little bit more about those as well. In addition to Section 5.0.4, we need to look at 5.0.7, which is around risk documentation. In this case, the sponsor, according to the language in the guideline itself, should describe the quality management approach implemented in the trial and summarize the important deviations from the quality tolerance limits. Now, the interesting piece here is it clearly says predefined. So the agency is expecting that the risk plan is in place during the study design stage, and that an assessment of the risks and tolerance limits be documented at that same stage. They'd be predefined. And therefore, the remedial actions can and should also be, as much as possible, predefined at that early stage. And then ultimately, that all of those activities and the monitoring and the activities and the actions taken to address those should be documented in a clinical study report. So in the actual final CSR that you prepare for a study, all of those predefined tolerance limits, the risks themselves, the parameters that relate to those, the actions taken, and the outcome of those actions are to be documented in the study report. I see here that someone has asked a question as an example of an acceptable risk. Acceptable risks could be those that, as an example, might pertain to a study timeline for a study that is not critical path to a major milestone or delivery. So even though, as an example, let's say patient enrollment has a risk of being 5 months or 6 months behind plan, if the study is not critical path to a timeline, that may be an acceptable risk. So that's a simple example, but there may be many others, and some that may even pertain to patient safety or data interpretability, but you have to intelligently think about those risks and how you would define that acceptability. So as we transition away from those definitional pieces and the regulatory expectations of those, let's look at what, through our efforts with the consortium and through other engagements with sponsors, regulators, and others, what constitutes leading practices for planning, evaluation, control, and documentation. First, you have to recognize that lessons have been learned. So we don't need to begin to monitor from the current date forward. We can look historically. So there is an effort to look at lessons learned in the past. So there should be efforts within each company to create a library of lessons from past experiences that future teams can access as they plan for a new project or a new phase of a project. It's unfortunate when companies do not learn from prior mistakes or prior challenges or issues and adopt leading practice mitigations for future teams, making them aware that the same risks may have a probability of occurring and may have significant impacts. Based on that, we should reduce the likelihood that future teams experience the same or similar issues over and over again. We should share and replicate the new practices or ideas that allow a prior project to run more smoothly. We should improve conformance, whether it's to budget, timeline, or other quality factors and compliance factors. We should reduce the number of negative surprises on future projects. That changes the culture and the success of an organization. But as we all know, there are always barriers that get voiced around why lessons learned cannot be done, should not be done, and so forth. And some of those are comically articulated here, that some are afraid to admit their mistakes. Sometimes there's fear that if we document them, there could be legal implications. But as you look on the right, sometimes there's recognition that items are too general and there are no solutions. That doesn't mean it can't or should be made more specific, and that solutions shouldn't come with the lessons learned. So frequently, prior teams may have already figured out solutions, and if they've found out solutions, why shouldn't new teams be learning which ones are most effective? Also, you'll see many others. There's whether lessons learned databases are too difficult to use. And I'll talk a little bit about what I call the difference between an active lessons learned database from a passive lessons learned database. A passive lessons learned database is where study teams may be forced at the end of the trial or may intentionally and positively collect lessons learned. And frequently, those are captured in some type of document and stored by a company in a SharePoint document location. Well, if you've ever been on a new study team going out to a SharePoint and looking across dozens and dozens of simple documents collected across dozens of other teams to try to extract lessons learned that are relevant for your team or mitigations that are good mitigations, it's almost impossible to do. It's so cumbersome, and during the time pressures of starting a new study, few new study teams ever do that. So a passive lessons learned is rarely successful. An active lessons learned I'll be talking about, which is where there's a more intentional effort to extract the risks that have highest probability and greatest impact, and the best mitigations or solutions, and populating those into an approach that allows new study teams to learn from that. So what's a leading practice lessons learned? It's contrary to just a postmortem approach. It's looking and learning from past mistakes and effective lessons that can be applied to new study teams. It's a concept of how you learn before, during, and after a study is starting and running and completed. And that's called an LBDA framework. There's some descriptions here around best practices for that and the organizational impact for that. For the sake of time today, I'm not going to dive into detail here, but these slides are available for all of you to look at more deeply, and the references are also provided so that you can further gain some insights about those best practices to do an LBDA approach. But what does that look like in our clinical settings and for our recommendations that we bring to you today? So from a learning before perspective, we recommend that you scan accumulated and learning materials from previous projects. And I'll talk more about how to make that an active lessons learned. Gleaning those best practices through due diligent elements and developing an optimized structure for how new projects can actually capture and access those. There's also learning during, whether it's for active studies or new studies that are, let's say, only months or perhaps a short time period after ongoing studies, where they can detect and monitor risks or issues that teams are facing for studies that are preceding theirs to make sure, again, that they learn from those and apply them to the ongoing study teams. And then finally, the learning after, which is the more traditional, but it's a more formal, systematic way of sitting a team down and doing the lessons learned and the activities. And that after may not be after an entire study is complete, but after a certain phase of a trial is complete. So as an example, after study start is complete, doing a lessons learned on the study startup process. After database lock is complete, doing a lessons learned on the database lock, and so forth. So Avoca has developed this concept in a leading practice, which is within our database of leading practice tools that are available for member companies. And it's how to, if we start at the blue box on the top, how you conduct lessons learned, and most importantly, how you upload those into a database that actually then becomes an active lessons learned database rather than a passive SharePoint location. How that then plays out is whether it's through an automated system, which is possible, or whether it's through a designated person who has devoted time to extract and select leading practice lessons learned and risks and leading practice mitigations to pre-populate a risk matrix with those so that new study teams begin to learn from prior study teams. The concept is then that as you proceed down through the green boxes, that the new study teams don't begin with a blank risk template. And I'm going to show you some of those here in a moment, whether those are Avoca tools, the Transcelerate Racked, or others. Instead of starting with blank tools, how do you begin to, within your organization, across your providers and across other stakeholder groups like investigative sites, how do you share and learn and start with pre-populated risk blueprints that study teams can then select the risks that do apply to them. They can add those that might be unique for their study teams, and they can actually look and find proven, documented leading practices for mitigations or contingencies that they don't have to brainstorm from scratch what those could be. And then as you go into the upper left yellow and orange boxes, then that process continues so that each active study team then begins to contribute to the lessons learned and then to the future blueprint, because that blueprint should not remain static, but should become an active, living, growing, improving, enhancing document over time. So what does that risk mapping look like? So you need to have risk tools. The Avoca Quality Consortium, as we indicate, has a risk tool. And as an image here, it is not intended for you to read the content here, but just to understand that there are tools out there like the Avoca Quality Consortium tool that identifies risks, documents mitigations, contingencies, as well as captures the probability, the impact, the detectability of those risks, whether it's the Avoca tool, the Racked tool from Transcelerate, or other tools. Those are available, and we highly recommend their use. These tools also frequently provide the option to project so that governance committees and others can focus on those very quickly and succinctly in whether you call them bubble diagrams or some kind of a shaded diagram that allows you to determine those that are in the upper right corner that should require the greatest focus and attention. So those are risk templates and tools, but again, it's not sufficient to use them in a blank fashion for each study team. So a centralized pre-populated risk blueprint is what we highly recommend. That allows knowledge management. It allows you to retain and manage the knowledge regarding prior program risks and leading practice mitigation solutions, as I've stated. We believe firmly that you need a center of excellence of some sort to do this. A center of excellence does not mean a large team of individuals or people, but it does mean at least an individual who has a designated significant portion of their time dedicated, where they are held accountable to extract the knowledge from each study team's lessons learned and manage a centralized tool or blueprint. And that can be done through a person. It can be through an automated artificial intelligence programmed process as well. And there are mechanisms to do that as well. So it's an ongoing evaluation of the lessons learned. What are the recurring high probable risks? What are the high impact risks that have had the greatest impact on study teams? What are leading practice mitigations and contingencies that can be pre-populated? And it ensures the consideration of common high impact risks by all development teams. And also for those within a company or across partnerships who own process improvements for SOPs or templates or tools. It also allows them to monitor those risks and mitigations and actually adapt and modify processes, tools, and templates so that they can reduce the systemic risk across an entire organization and across multiple study teams. So what does a blueprint look like? So here's the same template that I showed you, but now it begins to populate actual content. So as an example, some likely risks might be for patient enrollment or for study drug supply risks. So if those are factors here, you can highlight that, hey, these have a high probability. They happen on, let's say, 80% of our trials. So as an example, if patient enrollment risks of 3 months or more delay happens on 80% of your trials, that's a high probable impact. Now, that may be acceptable for a non-critical path study, but if you have a critical path primary endpoint registration trial, then it would be shame on you as a project lead person to allow that risk to play out to become an active issue. So what it allows you to do is to say, yes, that's probably an 80% probability, so therefore I need to be very proactive in a mitigation or contingencies. So now what are those leading practice mitigations and contingencies that we have already found to be successful? And that's where you identify those, and you can begin to populate those, and you work with executives and leaders within your organization to take those initiatives, even if they require funding and cost, but it gives you strength and evidence and proof when you are negotiating with executives about why you might need additional funds, additional resources, etc., during the study startup stage, rather than waiting until you have evidence that you are already 3 months behind on your study. Because once you're 3 months behind, you're unlikely to recover that. But if you take a proactive approach before the study begins, you can convince executives with proven historical lessons learned information why you should not allow that to happen on your study. So that's where this risk mapping and this kind of a diagram, again, allows you to bring it to the attention of executives in a very succinct fashion. So that's how we use these types of tools. That does then require that leaders have the ability and the desire to create a culture that accepts risk management versus reactive issue management. So this kind of a design and construct here, and even this PowerPoint slide deck, is something you can take to executives to help them understand their role and their responsibilities in leading a culture change from a reactive issues-based culture to a proactive risk culture. So by using some of those same blueprints and risk factors and the probability and the impact of them, you can create a culture within the leadership so that they visibly and actively sponsor and set expectations for proactive risk management, that they support you in actively monitoring, whether it's through governance and other avenues, and detect through proactive behaviors if risks for your study teams are beginning to become live issues or have the risk of becoming live issues, and or taking mitigations before they even begin to become issues, and rewarding that positive proactive behavior so that you can transition to that risk preventative culture. They may also provide support through funds, resources, and removing other barriers, as I've previously mentioned. So it's important to bring executives on board with that. So at this point, I'm going to open up a polling question. The polling question asks the following: to what extent does your organization benefit from an effective lessons learned process and risk mapping to a blueprint that for future study teams to benefit? Is that to a great extent, to a good extent, to some extent, not at all, or perhaps you don't even know? So if you would respond to that now, I'll give you a couple moments. Okay, let's see the results. So if we think about that, some of you feel very confident, about 14% to a great extent. But you'll see quite a distribution. And in fact, it's almost a bell curve to where, to some extent, is the peak of 37%, and then it does taper off to some, not at all, and some of you not even knowing what is in place. So from my perspective, there is tremendous improvement opportunities here for organizations to do this. And what's important is not only, it should not focus just within what you look at within your own organization, but the most effective risk-based approaches in quality systems look at risks across the handoffs that exist between sponsors and providers, between providers and investigative sites, and so forth. And so it's very important to have those blueprints focus on the holistic aspect of risk and quality systems. Okay. So the summary of where we have been to date, to this point in the presentation, is that ICH E6 Revision 2 requires that sponsors identify critical processes and data, that they identify the risks, evaluate them, control them, communicate them, review them, and report them. A key takeaway that I want you to walk away with now is that in the past, many companies have used risk-based approaches for a number of years, but it was out of their own insight and understanding that it actually benefited themselves and their organizations because there's lower emotional energy, lower anxiety, and better work-family balance when you take a risk-based approach and you prevent the fires that just suck you into and exhaust you into those daily emotional stress activities. So many companies have done it, many people have done it for some time. But now it's no longer a nice to have or something that is desired by some people, but it is required through compliance regulations. But there's also value of process improvements that come from that. There's benefits of lessons learned, and there's a power, an absolute power in risk mapping and blueprints that we hope you take away from the summary at this point in time. So let's continue then to say that you can't do, though, active assessments and ongoing mitigations unless you have an effective use of metrics that are tied to your risk plan and your risk tools. So what does that look like? And again, some of that is defined by what we just saw with ICH E6 Revision 2. So first, I want to clarify terminology. We want to distinguish operational risk indicators, such as KRIs, that frequently have thresholds tied to those. And that's where the industry historically is accustomed to using key risk indicators and thresholds. And those are fine, and there's still appropriate use of those, and I'll describe that. But the ICH E6 Revision 2 very articulately talks about parameters that have quality tolerance limits. So what's the distinction? So key risk indicators can be operational or critical data risks for trial execution. Thresholds are typically tied to those that are associated with them to detect potential issues that can be mitigated and thresholds met for action to be taken. That's still very, very appropriate, especially for timeline risks, for cost-based risks, and other quality risks that are not specifically tied typically to patient safety or the interpretability of data. But quality tolerance limits are called out by the regulators in ICH E6 R2 that trial parameters or variables must be identified. Quality tolerance limits are not those parameters, but they are the limits tied to those parameters whereby they assess that a systematic trend or issue has occurred that requires action. And it requires action because it either means that there's an implication for patient safety or an implication for the interpretability of the data. So therefore, risks are within those limits, or when they're in it, then the quality is adequate and no action is needed. But if they're outside the limits, then action is necessary. So what does that look like? So what is a quality tolerance limit? It's a level point or value associated with the parameter that should trigger an evaluation to determine if there is a systematic or systemic issue. For the purposes of today's webinar, we will refer to the requirements of ICH E6 R2 for that. So in an image, it looks like this. So if you have a parameter, it could be a biochemical parameter for a safety parameter of a patient. It could be from a blood chemistry test. It could be some other test. It could be from a patient-reported outcome parameter. There could be many parameters. It could also be data interpretability parameters. So it could be a parameter related to a primary or secondary endpoint. What you want to do then is you want to define an upper quality tolerance limit whereby it really has implication to patient safety or data interpretability, and you have to be prepared to articulate how you prevented or tried to prevent that from happening, or if it did happen in your clinical study report, what the implications were. We do highly recommend, though, a secondary limit. So a secondary limit is a point where mitigation steps may be taken. So your risk plan is tied to this. It's tied closely to this, whereby you would execute and implement mitigations or perhaps contingencies. The upper limit, though, is a point where patient safety or data integrity or interpretability are impacted and actions should be taken and documented very formally. So when we look at that, there are many areas that can define tolerance limits And this was published a few years ago, but identifies areas around trial data, things that I've mentioned, such as efficacy parameters in the dark blue box on the left pertaining to trial data, or safety parameters, or perhaps inclusion-exclusion criteria. You'll see in the lighter blue box the trial procedures. There could be compliance factors around the protocol, GCP factors. There could be things related to activities that tie to that are also still very important, should be in your risk plans and risk management plans. And we'll talk about that, but those might be more appropriate for key risk indicators and thresholds and not formally documented as a tolerance limit parameter. Now, trial management also in decision-making, such as monitoring, data management, safety activities that are being conducted on a trial may also warrant some risk-based approaches and mitigations and contingencies, but they may or may not tie into a quality tolerance limits. So while we circle and highlight in red the left dark blue box as most likely parameters for quality tolerance limits, we do not want you to exclude consideration for the others, either as potential tolerance limits or definitely as key risk indicators and thresholds that you would manage through a risk plan. Remember, though, that when it pertains to quality tolerance limits, I'm going to restate part of the language that I showed earlier for Section 5.0.4. And that is the regulator's focus is on identifying systematic issues that can impact subject safety or reliability of trial results. So the focus is on those parameters. So be clear that when you create a risk plan, and this is what I typically do now, is within an individual risk plan, I may capture risks that pertain to parameters relevant for quality tolerance limits, but I will also capture risks pertaining to operational risks, timeline risks, other quality risks, and or cost risks. But I will uniquely distinguish those that warrant quality tolerance limits from those that are more routinely managed through key risk indicators and thresholds. Therefore, within that template that I showed you in the blueprint, it can be used to highlight those that are most relevant for quality tolerance limits. Very quickly here, what are some parameters that might warrant quality tolerance limits? This is in no way comprehensive, but it's just to give you an example. It might be a parameter that relates to the number or percent of entered subjects that do not meet one or more of a protocol entry criteria. On the far right, the justification for that parameter is that a high number of subjects entered that do not meet the criteria can have an impact on the interpretation of primary endpoints or other secondary endpoints and the validity of the study. That's why the regulatory agencies are especially interested in that type of parameter. The second one, as an example, is the number or percent of subjects with premature drug discontinuation might be important. The justification is very similar. It can decrease exposure and therefore the power of the study. The last one is around the number or percent of subjects classified as lost to follow-up. In some instances, especially as, let's say, if a study is an outcomes-based study, and let's say death is your outcome of your primary endpoint, well, if lost to follow-up by regulators is required to be classified as dead, then if you have equal numbers of loss to follow-up in your treatment arm and your comparator arm, it begins to dilute the ability for you to distinguish active difference between your treatment and the comparator. So again, it reduces the impact of the power or the ability to interpret primary and secondary endpoints. So those are some examples. Finally, then, there's a question around when may adjustments to QTLs be appropriate. Now, for some reason, there's an animation here that's not coming up, so I'll just speak to what the slides are on it. So for some reason, there's content here that's not showing. It's going to the polling question next. So I will just verbalize this. And that is that adjustments, many people in the industry have said, can we adjust QTLs once a study has begun? Because you are required by regulations to predefine those tolerance limits at the beginning of the study. It is our recommendation as a consortium that the adjustment of QTLs should be the exception and not the rule. However, there are appropriate times to do that. sometimes from a medical knowledge perspective and patient safety perspective, you may gain new insights on the safety of a treatment and or the risks of a disease state while a study is in progress. So whether there's new published literature about similar treatment groups that might have the same mechanism of action, or whether there's disease information published that impacts patient safety, that might warrant a change in your quality tolerance limit. There may be some things related to changes in regulations or acceptability of trial data for interpretability of results for some endpoints, whereby you may also, mid-study, need to change it. So if regulations change about whether lost to follow-up patients do or don't affect the classification of death to a patient, that might warrant a change in the quality tolerance limit. So I apologize for this slide not showing the animation, but that will be in the final slide deck when it is shared with you. So as we come to the closure of this presentation, we do have some additional polling questions. First, to what extent has your organization effectively implemented the use of QTLs across your study teams and other stakeholder groups, such as those that are inclusive of sponsors, CROs, technical service providers, and investigative sites? To a great extent, a good extent, some extent, a little extent, or not at all? I'll give you a moment to answer. Okay. Looks like QTLs are still in its infancy stage. So as we highlight here, there's majority of you are to some extent, and that's about a quarter of you, or to a little extent, another quarter. And many of you, not at all, but only about 4% do these to a great extent. So again, just to highlight, the use of QTLs and the design and the construct of those are required by ICH Ethics Revision 2, which became effective in November of 2016, and many regulatory agencies as early as June of 2017 indicated that they will begin to hold companies accountable to those new R2 requirements. So as the industry and the Avoca Quality Consortium is monitoring this, we are beginning to look to evaluate if regulatory inspections begin to look at how QTLs are designed at the beginning of trials, managed and monitored throughout the conduct of trials, and documented in clinical study reports. Of course, there is a lag in starting those within trials and having inspectors ultimately review those, but we are beginning to see anecdotal reports that regulators are beginning to inspect or set expectations to inspect against those. The next question: to what extent do you personally understand the purpose and use of QTLs on your study teams? Great extent, good extent, some extent, little extent, not at all, or do not know? I'll give you a moment to answer. Okay, I will transition. So it looks like the understanding of them is higher. So slightly over 40% of you say to a good extent, another 32% or so say to some extent. So the understanding is higher. The actual implementation of those in the prior slide is somewhat less. So in summary of metrics in QTLs, quality tolerance limits are established during the planning stages of trials. The QTLs identify if systematic issues are occurring that may impact subject safety or the reliability of trial results. When a QTL is exceeded, an evaluation of the deviation is triggered. And we also highly recommend the use of secondary lower limits that would trigger risk mitigation or contingency plans through your risk planning and activities. So that becomes an active part of a living, beneficial, valuable risk mapping and risk planning process. Now, then finally, important deviations and the associated parameters in QTLs are reported in the clinical study report along with the remedial actions taken. So at that point, I'd like to open it to questions. We'll begin to look at those.
Yes, Steve, we have had several questions come in during your presentation. And I've picked a few here that I think would be good for you to answer. So the first one is, where should the QTLs and other aspects of the risk management exercise be documented?
Very good question. There is not a predefined answer within the regulations other than when the study is complete, the parameters and quality tolerance limits and the entire process of how you documented it up front and how you actively lived with those evaluations and conduct, they must be documented in a section of your clinical study report. So what obviously in our minds through the Avoca group is very logical is with the advent also of ICH E6R2 and the requirement to have pre-documented risk plans, it makes a lot of sense to capture those parameters and the quality tolerance limits within your risk plans because they are so focused on risk. The reason you are identifying the parameters is that they have risks for patient safety and data interpretability, and the tolerance limits are points at which you should take actions. But we recommend, again, that therefore in your risk plans you identify triggers. The triggers can be a metric that hopefully is a leading indicator metric, and the point at which you take actions, and that could be a multiple point. You could have a secondary limit that you take an action. You could have a tolerance limit. Those would be for the parameters that qualify for a QTL. But you would also, within your risk plans, use thresholds for other key risk indicators and the metrics tied to those. So our recommendation is to definitely do them in your risk plans. Those could be then referenced from your clinical study report as well as from your quality management systems or quality management plans. But you could also, if chosen within your SOPs, define other documents for where those would be stored and tracked. And they could be through an automated metrics system that could be pre-programmed or governance committee activities. So, other questions?
Very good. Okay, yes, here's another question for you, Steve. As a small company sponsor who primarily works with CROs for trial management, to what extent would the CROs be expected to participate in the risk management process?
So my quick answer is whether you're a small company, mid-size, or large sponsor company, we would recommend that the CRO be engaged with all of you in risk planning, especially when the CRO and even other high-risk providers, so providers that might be providing data relevant for your primary endpoints, secondary endpoints, that they in some way are engaged and included in your overall risk plan activities. Now, for small companies and even for some mid-size and large sponsor companies, you may, quote-unquote, delegate that to a CRO so that they use their risk planning tools and their approaches and so forth. And that delegation is certainly possible. But again, you have to make note that ICH E6R2 clearly indicates that the sponsor is still accountable. So you cannot abdicate your accountability even when you delegate responsibility. Now, the caveat that I also highlight is that the CRO very typically has and may have very efficient, effective risk planning tools and processes. You will want to make sure as a sponsor, however, that their focus is not solely on the conduct of the clinical study, because they themselves will focus on compliance and delivery of the trial, because that is their end result of what defines quality. For a sponsor, their definition of quality extends all the way to where you will submit your market authorization approvals to regulatory agencies. You will be the one who will have your data interpretability evaluated by those agencies. So the end result of obtaining approval for a market authorization or the desired label language is something that comes after a CRO is typically complete. So a sponsor, even a small sponsor, should not delegate to the point where they are not consciously working with a CRO to incorporate outcomes and end results that matter to the sponsor as well as those that matter to the CRO. Also, in just closing on this thought, typically a sponsor may use a CRO to do a subset of the trial activities, and the CRO therefore focuses on risks related to what they are doing. But you have to ultimately, as a sponsor, integrate multitudes of providers into a holistic end result, and therefore a risk management system should incorporate risks that canvas more broadly than just the services that might be outsourced to a specific CRO. So you should also have some engagement from a sponsor from that more holistic view of the risks that are integrated across all those stakeholders.
Thank you,
Any other questions?
Yes. So I wanted to say we have a lot of great questions coming in, and as Kristen mentioned in the beginning, you're not going to be able to answer them all on this call. However, we will be following up with all of the questions in writing within the next few business days. I think you might have time to answer another question here before we wrap up. And this is sort of a two-part question. It is, we have people who want to understand where QTLs are to be documented and how to best encourage your company to implement them.
So I touched already a little bit on that first part of the question. So you should consider documenting, or you must consider documenting QTLs prospectively in a study. So the regulations require it at the beginning. Again, we recommend that that could well be done in your documented risk plans. But you could choose alternatives where they're documented in a automated metrics tool or some other type of tool. But in those cases, they should map to clarity of something that is clearly articulated as a risk parameter and a quality tolerance limit and the reasons for those risks and quality tolerance limits. And if your automated system does not allow that, you might need to have a couple systems work in harmony for that. To the means by which you get organizational buy-in for this is very clearly focusing that this is no longer an option from a regulator and risk perspective relative to ICH E6R2, and to articulate that while we have not yet seen robust inspections against this, inspectors, especially from European agencies, but also to some extent from the FDA, have begun to set expectations with some consortium member companies that in future visits they will be inspecting against those. So it's important to articulate that those have implications not just on the cost of running a study, but ultimately on the cost and implications of market authorization approvals and so forth. So that typically garners more recognition and support as you try to engage the vertical aspects of executives all the way down to operational study teams about the importance, especially when most do desire to get new products to the patients, and you don't want a lack of achieving the assessment of quality tolerance limits to be a factor that affects that. Okay?
All right, fantastic. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. I want to also thank the Avoca group and everyone else who is in attendance. You will receive an email in a couple days that will include the slide deck, the recorded version of this webinar, and some additional information on some upcoming related events. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and conclude the webinar, and just another thank you to Steve and the Avoca group. Really appreciate all you guys are doing. Thanks, everyone.